150,000 to 246,000. Just take a second to let that number sink in. That is the staggering, honestly almost incomprehensible number of human beings killed when the United States detonated 2 atomic bombs over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. It's a figure that immediately grabs your attention, right? And it's one that completely, forever altered the course of human history.
Now, that massive death toll sits right at the center of an incredibly intense historical debate, one that is still raging today. On one hand, you have folks who argue that these bombings were an absolute necessity. The thought process here is that they brought a swift end to World War II, which ultimately resulted in way fewer casualties than a full-scale mainland invasion would have. Plus, they argue the sheer terror of these weapons actually ushered in the long peace of the Cold War era. But, on the flip side, critics firmly argue the exact opposite. They see the bombings as completely unnecessary, classifying them as a war crime with absolutely devastating moral implications. To them, this opened Pandora's box, making a future nuclear holocaust a very real looming threat. Throughout this explainer, we aren't here to pick a side. Our goal is just to look strictly at the facts, the context, and the incredibly complex history that led up to those 2 blinding flashes of light.
So, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the geopolitical, scientific, and military escalation that ultimately culminated in the first, and so far the only, use of nuclear weapons in armed conflict. We're going to visualize exactly how the devastating, grinding momentum of the Pacific War violently collided with a top-secret $2 billion race for the atomic bomb.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the horrific toll of the Pacific War, the grim calculus behind the planned mainland invasion, the massive scale of the Manhattan Project, the devastating conventional firebombing campaign, and finally, the highly specific preparations required for the atomic strikes themselves. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Pacific War's Toll, the Escalating Bloodbath.
Okay, so to really understand the decisions made in 1945, we first have to grasp the sheer brutality of a war entering its 4th grueling year. Because as the Allies pushed closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, the fighting just became exponentially more lethal. Just look at the shift in the casualty ratio here. In the Philippines, it was 5 Japanese casualties for every 1 American. But by the time we get to Okinawa, that ratio drops to 2 to 1. And what's even more staggering are the defender mortality rates. The Japanese military simply did not surrender. Nearly 99% of the 21,000 defenders on Iwo Jima fought to the literal death. On Okinawa, 94% of the 117,000 defending troops were killed. It's just unbelievable.
Meanwhile, the situation for everyday civilians inside Japan was rapidly deteriorating into complete societal collapse. Thanks to the Allied blockade and the total destruction of their shipping lines, Japan's merchant fleet declined by over 70%. The nation was literally starving. To put that into perspective, the 1945 fish catch was only 22% of what it was before the war, and they were facing their worst rice harvest since 1909. The internal crisis got so dire that by February 1945, Prince Fumimaro Konoe bluntly advised Emperor Hirohito that defeat was inevitable. He even went as far as urging him to abdicate. It's a really striking historical detail because it shows that even the absolute top Japanese officials knew the end was rapidly approaching.
Section 2. Preparing to Invade, Operation Downfall, and the Grim Calculus.
So even before Nazi Germany officially surrendered, the Allies were already busy planning the largest amphibious operation in the history of the Pacific War. But thanks to the geography of the islands, the Japanese knew exactly where they were going to land. They prepared something called Operation Ketsugo, which was an all-out, zero-reserve defense of the southern island of Kyushu. Through cracked codes, known as ultra-intelligence, the Americans watched in absolute alarm as the Japanese mobilized 2.3 million army troops, and backing them up, an unbelievable civilian militia of 28 million people. Seriously, just let that number sink in for a second. 28 million armed civilians waiting on the beaches.
Now, this massive mobilization forced Allied military planners to confront a really grim mathematical reality. The estimates for an invasion were, frankly, terrifying. A Joint War Plans Committee estimated up to 220,000 U.S. casualties. But then, a separate study commissioned by Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson projected something much, much worse, between 1.7 and 4 million Allied casualties, with up to 800,000 dead. And for the Japanese, a catastrophic 5 to 10 million fatalities. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi even predicted up to 20 million Japanese deaths. The sheer scale of the projected loss of life is just hard to wrap your head around.
The projected bloodbath was so incredibly severe that General George C. Marshall began contemplating the unthinkable. He started looking for readily available weapons to, quote, decrease the cost in American lives. And here's a truly dark piece of history. The desperate American planners actually began stockpiling chemical weapons, things like phosgene, mustard gas, and tear gas. They were literally moving them to Luzon in preparation to use them during the invasion of Japan. That's how desperate the situation was looking.
Section 3. The Manhattan Project. The $2 billion race.
But behind the scenes, there was another weapon being developed in absolute secrecy. This whole thing started as theoretical science back with the discovery of nuclear fission in 1938, and it quickly snowballed into a world-altering weapon. By 1939, terrified that Nazi Germany might actually build an atomic bomb first, scientists drafted the famous Einstein-Szilard letter to President Roosevelt. This early research accelerated massively following the 1941 British Maud Committee report, which essentially proved that a bomb was practically achievable. And that birthed the Manhattan Project. This was a mammoth $2 billion industrial and scientific undertaking. At its peak, we're talking about a project that employed over 125,000 people across dozens of different sites.
Under the scientific direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer out at the Los Alamos Laboratory, this unbelievable concentration of resources yielded not just one, but two distinct types of atomic weapons by 1945. First, you had Little Boy, which was an enriched uranium-235 gun-type fission weapon. Then you had Fat Man, a highly complex plutonium-239 implosion-type nuclear weapon. They were two completely different designs, built in parallel, basically just to ensure that at least one of them would actually work.
Section 4. Firebombing Japan, the conventional air campaign. Now, while the atomic bombs were being finalized out in the New Mexico desert, the skies over Japan were already ablaze. See, earlier in the war, high-altitude precision bombing using the new B-29 Superfortress bombers proved highly ineffective. This was due to tough logistics, bad weather, and the fact that Japanese manufacturing was widely dispersed into small workshops and private homes. Enter Major General Curtis LeMay. He comes in and completely changes the tactics. He concluded that low-level incendiary raids, basically massive firebombing, against entire Japanese cities were really the only way to destroy their war industries and totally undermine civilian morale.
The statistics of this conventional air campaign are just horrifying. Take Operation Meeting House, the firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945. It remains the deadliest single air raid in human history. We're talking an estimated 100,000 people dead in a single night, 41 square kilometers and 267,000 buildings completely destroyed. Over the next 6 months, LeMay's bombers would go on to firebomb a total of 64 Japanese cities, shifting to smaller and smaller population centers as the larger ones were literally reduced to ash. This was the grim, devastating context of aerial warfare that the atomic bomb was about to be introduced into.
Section 5. Preparing the Strikes, the 509th Composite Group.
You have to remember, dropping a brand new, highly unstable nuclear weapon required hyper-specific, intense tactical preparation. So, in late 1944, the military activated the 509th Composite Group under the command of Colonel Paul Tibbets. Operating out of remote bases, these bombardiers conducted incredibly rigorous training. They did these 50 practice drops of inert or conventional explosive weapons, which they called pumpkin bombs. And here's a crazy detail. They intentionally flew single, unescorted bombers over Japan to accustom the Japanese military to this exact pattern. They were actively tricking enemy radar operators into just ignoring lone planes. Clever, right? By May 1945, this advanced party was deployed to Northfield on the island of Tinian in the Marianas.
Now, to safely carry and deploy those massive nuclear payloads, standard bombers just wouldn't cut it. The military had to use specialized, heavily modified B-29s, known as the Silver Plate series. These planes were completely stripped down. They were equipped with fuel-injected engines, reversible pitch propellers to allow for much shorter landings, and pneumatic actuators that let the bomb bay doors snap open and shut in a fraction of a second. Every little detail was highly engineered for this one specific task. To oversee this completely unprecedented mission, high-level leadership was embedded directly at the base in the Marianas. Captain William S. Parsons, Rear Admiral William R. Purnell, and Brigadier General Thomas Farrell became known as the Tinian Joint Chiefs. They were fully empowered to make the final, on-the-spot strategic decisions regarding exactly how and when to deploy the atomic weapons.
Finally, a target committee had to decide where to actually drop them. They nominated 5 potential cities for destruction. Kokura, because of its massive munitions plants. Hiroshima, an embarkation port and major military headquarters. Yokohama, a massive hub for aircraft manufacturing. Niigata, a crucial port with steel and oil facilities. And Kyoto, a major industrial center. These locations were explicitly chosen because they had large urban populations that also housed highly significant military and industrial facilities. As we all know from history, the final orders targeted Hiroshima and just a few days later, Nagasaki.
The events of August 1945 brought the absolute deadliest conflict in human history to a close. But they also opened a door that can literally never be closed again. So I want to leave you with this to think about. How do those unimaginable statistics, the brutal mathematical calculus of a planned invasion, and the high-stakes logistical decisions of 1945 shape our ongoing, modern debate over the ethics of warfare? And how does the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki continue to define the fragile reality of our long peace today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the history that shapes our world, and I'll catch you next time.